Very simple story about a man, an emperor, and a priest. And while they didn't really walk into a sewer, it just makes a catchy title. This is really a story about three men who would have been seen as unremarkable in their own lives, but through the power of working together, through the power of a shared vision, they were able to create something that continues to shape the world today. The three people in my story um, shared a common goal, shared a common vision. And when they were able to look past their own limitations, they were able to create something remarkable. The first man in my story is a guy called Georges Eugene Haussmann. Now, he was born into a very middle class family. Essentially, one would think he was born into a life of privilege. And while he went into the military, he studied law and politics at university. Um, he felt that his future was in the civil service. So he was a prefect in one of the districts of France in 1831. He held several civil service posts, but essentially he was stuck in middle management. Many people commented that he was seen as arrogant and boastful, and that was because he would frequently just disagree with his superiors on how things should be done, and often felt that he was held back. And for many people, they believe that this was the end of his career, but not many would have foreseen that he would become one of the most important people in the history of France because he was about to meet one of the most powerful men in the French Empire. Now, many people know Napoleon Bonaparte. Not many people know that Napoleon, while he didn't have children, had, I think, three nephews, all of whom were Emperor of France at one stage. Charles Napoleon Bonaparte III was one of the younger nephews of Napoleon, and he had in fact staged two unsuccessful coups trying to take power in France. And as a result of that, he spent most of his life in exile. When the French Revolution came about in 1848, he then stood for election and was elected democratically as the first president of France. And interestingly, having spent most of his life outside of France, he had this vision of creating or making France the center of European commerce, the center of European innovation and technology. And to his dismay, he arrived in France and found that Paris was an absolute dump. Now, having lived in cities like Frankfurt that had embraced industrialization, embraced modernization, it was really a huge blow to his plans to find that the streets of Paris were literally covered in filth due to having multiple uh, animals, goats, dogs traversing the streets, littering it with feces. The people themselves, not having sewage, would throw their feces out of their windows straight into the streets. It stank. It was disgusting. There were all sorts of illegal trades going on. It was very far from the modern Paris that we envision in those times and that we see today. And Napoleon understood that his very first act as emperor would have to be the revitalization of Paris and creating the standard that was starting to emerge in the rest of Europe of a modern city that was open to commerce. I mean, if you just look at these littered streets, how could you deliver goods? How could you have vibrant trade coming in from other cities when you literally just you couldn't walk from end to end without stepping in muck? So he understood that this was his first task, and he assembled all of his prefects, all of his civil servants, and he said, "This is what we need to do. We need to rebuild Paris." And to his dismay, everyone said, "Nope, it can't be done. This is impossible. This is going to be too expensive. How are we going to relocate all of these people? We don't have the money." And he just getting no after no after no until he finally met Georges Eugene Haussmann. And Georges Eugene Haussmann said, "Yes." He said, "I can do this." We don't know whether he really had the experience. It doesn't seem like he did, but he had the confidence and he had the belief, and he shared Napoleon's vision that this is where Paris needed to go. He was given carte blanche and unlimited funds, and over the next 30 years, he essentially rebuilt the center of Paris. He displaced hundreds of thousands of people, demolished hundreds of buildings, some of them who were close to 1,000 years old. But he demolished huge sections of the city to build wider streets, to build sewers, to start building infrastructure for lights and electricity. And Paris was well on its way, but it was becoming very expensive. And, the emperor was starting to wonder, am I really doing the right thing? And it wasn't until he met this man, Giovanni Caselli, that he really understood what his true vision was. Now, Giovanni Caselli, as many people in the Renaissance era were, was a man of many, many talents and many, many passions. He was a priest fundamentally, but he was also a physicist, he was also a philosopher, and he was also a scientist and an inventor. And he was particularly interested in electronics, he was interested in magnetism and electrophysics. And one of the things that had inspired him was when Samuel Morse had managed to send an electrical signal from Washington all the way to Baltimore, and that signal could be used as a form of communication using very basic Morse code. And Caselli believed that this was something that was very interesting and that he wanted to spend a lot of time on. When Napoleon met him, he was introduced to him by the Duke of Florence, who was Caselli's patron, and the Duke of Florence was actually quite despondent, not knowing where this technology was going to go. He had spent a lot of money on it, and I think he was probably hoping that Napoleon would take over this burden of funding Caselli. So Napoleon sat down with Caselli, said, "Show me what you've got, let's have a look." And when Caselli had finished his presentation, Napoleon realized in that moment that he was about to change the world forever. He rushed back to Paris, met with George Haussmann, and gave him a new blueprint of what Paris needs to look like. And that blueprint has changed the world and continues to change the world today. What did Caselli show him? Caselli showed him an image that he had created. He then scanned that image using very, very rudimentary technology. It was called a pantelegraph. That image was then converted into voltage and was transmitted over a copper wire to a second receptor, a second pantelegraph, which then translated that voltage back into the image. He had essentially invented the world's first fax machine. Napoleon understood that telecommunications over these kinds of distances would change the world forever. The way that we communicated legal documents, the way we communicated financial documents, everything would change the moment that data was able to be transmitted over long distances. And he understood that if Paris was going to be the center of European commerce, they needed to harness this technology. The genius of both Haussmann and Napoleon was that they then understood that in order to do this, infrastructure and the way that infrastructure was built would need to be centered around telecommunications. So as they were already building sewers, they then started building telecommunication ducts running along the sewer lines to ensure that every single part of the city could be connected and could be wired into the telecommunications infrastructure that would then connect the entirety of Paris. But that wasn't the end of this genius innovation, because what the emperor then did was he then invited other telecommunications operators who had been working on telegraph technology using Samuel Morse's invention, and he invited them all to Paris. This would have been somewhere around the 1860s. And he said, in order for us to make Europe successful, we as telegraph operators need to work together. We need to ensure that we can send a signal from anywhere in Europe to any other part of Europe to enable commerce, to enable communication, and to empower the communities and to empower the entrepreneurs in those countries. When they sat down, they agreed on rates that would be standard. They agreed on interconnectivity so that everyone would be able to use each other's network. Essentially, what they sat down was to discuss an open access framework, which would then form the basis of telecommunications for the next 200 or 300 years. That body that sat down eventually became the International Telegraph Union, which was the very first telecommunications body in the world. And 10 years later, a gentleman by the name of Emile Baudot, a Frenchman who was living in Paris, looked at what was being built, used this very same telegraph infrastructure and said, why just send pictures? If we can send some sort of information over voltage, why can't that information handle large volumes of data? So he designed a form of Unicode which could take any type of information, translate it into very rudimentary characters, which could then be translated or transmitted over copper, received at another point, and then reassembled into large volumes of data. That code that he developed was the very first version of ASCII, which is the foundation of all digital data that we still use today and was refined in the 1930s in America. So what these three men did changed the world and continues to change the world as we talk about the digital divide, as we talk about what we need to do as an infrastructure and as a digital company. It all started here with these three seemingly unremarkable men. And what was it that drove them? Firstly, it was the willingness to be bold. For Napoleon, it was the courage to stand up and say, we need to do something that seems impossible. And it was the boldness of Haussmann to say, no one knows how this needs to be done, but I'm willing to stand up and try it. It was built on trusted relationships between these three men who would work together, who would share information unselfishly for the betterment of their country, for the betterment of the greater continent, and also for the betterment of mankind. And essentially they understood that what they were doing was the right thing. Napoleon knew that this was the right thing for Paris. He knew that Paris could not ascend into the next century without this reconstruction. Caselli knew that there was something in what he was working on that was going to uplift mankind. And those three values, binding these men together, resulted in a greatness that continues to give value today. Thank you.